I'm Rob Robson. I'm our Director of People Science. And today I'll be handing over most of the responsibility for content to our guest, Rob Baker. Rob, I'll let you introduce yourself rather than me trying to do it.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks for everyone spending some time with me and Rob today. I appreciate your time. It's a precious commodity at the moment for all of us. So my name's Rob Baker, and I'm the founder of Tailored Thinking, and we are a positive psychology, wellbeing, and HR consultancy. And now our aim, our mission is to strive to be a force for good in the world of work. So my background's been in traditional HR roles. I've done psychology as studied at university, and subsequently as a master's in positive psychology. And very much in terms of my approach and things we'll be talking about today, Rob, why I enjoy talking to you so regularly, is just the opportunity to actually apply the research that we know from psychology and organizational scholarship into practice within organizations. And so that's kind of what we strive to do, to bridge that gap in a way that I know that you guys do as well with a PX experience.
Okay, brilliant. So we're just going to start off on the basics. I mean, everybody can relate to what autonomy means in some way. I think we can all say that we kind of understand what it when we don't have autonomy. We can all kind of relate to that. But in the world of psychology, it kind of has a slightly more specific meaning. So Rob, do you want to just tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the specifics, certainly for me, when I talk to organizations about autonomy, and what it kind of looks and feels like, it's around having a sense of kind of freedom, I suppose, to a certain extent, and flexibility in terms of how people approach tasks or activities and the relationships, kind of any element of their work. So there's an element of kind of freedom here. What that looks like is that if someone has done a task or an activity and they've had autonomy, it means that they probably feel that their fingerprints have been on that task or that decision somehow, so they've had some freedom and space to do it. And it's something that we'll kind of come on to talk about, but it's very much something that as humans we kind of really crave and saying, so we search for with our work. Often, in terms of when it comes to autonomy, different people will have different levels of wanting it, if that makes sense, and it might, depending on where you are in your career or with your job as well. But pretty much fundamentally, everyone kind of wants it. It's a bit like oxygen, I suppose. Without it, without oxygen, you kind of suffocate, and without autonomy, it starves you of engagement and energy and commitment, which is again something that we're kind of both really interested in focusing on.
Yeah, a really interesting analogy. And I think what I find interesting about autonomy is that it's about freedom, but it's about, I think there's a couple of different types of freedom, if you like. It's not just about freedom from constraints, is it? But it's also about the freedom to, or the ability to influence what you do as well.
Yes, absolutely. So I think for me, it's around, it's freedom to influence, it's freedom to do things. So it's proactive and reactive, I suppose, in terms of those measurements. Yeah. So that I'd certainly agree with that. Yeah.
So before we get into kind of why, a bit more about why autonomy is important in organizations in particular, and then following on from that, what we can do about it. I know we had a question that we wanted to put to the audience, didn't we, to kind of illustrate why autonomy can be important. Have you got the?
So the question I was going to ask people. So I want us to think that imagine that we're kind of town planners. So we're going to take a bit of an esoteric view here to looking at autonomy, but bear with us, everyone, in terms of this. And I'm going to ask for those on the kind of maybe the Zoom chat just to give us a note here in terms of any comments that they've got. So I want you to think that you're a town planner within an organization, and I want you to think about whether the you've got a junction, and into a junction in terms of that you've got a bit of a road junction, and I want you to think about whether you want to put in a roundabout or whether you want to put into a traffic light. So from a safety perspective, what do you think will be kind of will be a safer option? Would it be the traffic light where you've got really clear signals telling people kind of what to go to manage the traffic that everyone understands? Or is it the roundabout where actually you're kind of relying on other people kind of following the rules of the road? So from your perspective as someone town planner, what do you think is the safest thing to put in? And for those that can, I can see some people here on some of the Zoom links. Can you just put an R for if you think roundabouts, or a T for traffic lights if you think they're safer?
And if you're on LinkedIn, do it as well. And we can't see it, but Savannah and Naomi might be able to see that.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we've had a couple
roundabouts.
Roundabouts.
Everyone's doing roundabouts so far.
So
okay, so let's ask why they think roundabout, because they seems to be fairly unanimous in terms of the response we're getting.
Yeah.
So any comments as to why? Okay, we're having some issues on LinkedIn there. Okay, Rob, I'll leave it to here we go. You have to think about it. So Kate saying you have to think about it when trying to drive.
Yeah, that's true. That's really nice. And Sarah saying to be more conscious surroundings choice, wait for someone to tell you what to. So it's a nice. So you're kind of often when we come to talking about autonomy and when we come to talking about these ideas, it's around who you're designing for. Is it you're designing for kind of for Mr. Perfect, the rational human being, or you're designing for kind of Mr. Messy, which is, or Mrs. Messy, which is, I'd say, the human kind of element of us. We're all human. We make mistakes. We're kind of messy. So the traffic lights would be, I think, would be the rational, the Mr. Perfect solution, because you've got clear signals. They're telling people what to do in terms of the traffic light. But everyone is voted as being correct. So when you look at the research around traffic accidents, and when you look at in terms of junctions, and when they've put in roundabouts and compared them with traffic lights, the roundabouts are significantly safer than traffic lights. And the explanation that researchers have come up with, exactly the ones that chime in with Sarah and Kate and others that have put in on the chat, which is the fact that actually they rely on other people to kind of slow down in terms of the junction. You need to kind of check in with other people, other drivers, and you need to kind of collectively manage that decision together. And so, but again, the rational viewpoint would be that traffic lights would be more sensible. But what happens with traffic lights is that people kind of switch off a little bit of their brain. So they basically will kind of, maybe they're distracted and they'll go through a red light by mistake. And we've probably all done that. I've done it once or twice, and it's terrifying because you've got to realize you've done it and it's afterwards, and no one's looking out for you. So a pedestrian might walk in the road if they think the other lights are red, or another car is not looking out for you. So the collisions and crashes you have are more significant as well. And the reason I'm kind of sharing this, the reason I wanted to kind of explore and talk about traffic lights and roundabouts is I think this also applies to autonomy, and it also applies to organizations, in the fact that I think a lot of organizations with the best intentions could make decisions or give roles in a very traffic light kind of mentality, which is do this in this way, and it's very top down, it's very directional in terms of what we're doing. And the cost of that, the cost of squeezing out people's autonomy in terms of how they navigate those things, is that people don't fully commit, they don't check in with each other, they aren't asked to kind of fully and actively engage. And I mean, again, that's kind of the thing that I would say in terms of autonomy. That's what it kind of feels like in terms of an absence of that, is that you're just going to be a switch on. You can do what you're told, and that might feel comfortable, it might feel fine, but the chances are you're leaving an element of your own discretion, your own judgment, kind of on the table. And the other thing I'll just ask people in terms of on the chat as well. So just how did it feel? Do people remember the first time they went around a roundabout when they were learning to drive, or after they passed their test? So again, on the chat, what are people's experiences? And Rob, do you remember your first roundabout are you too old for that?
It was a long time ago. But I think it was pretty terrifying. You know, what springs to mind is the Coventry Ring Road. I don't know if anyone else has ever been on that.
Yeah.
But the Coventry Ring Road has no explicit on and off system. It's one. I can't really describe it. The on and off ramp is one thing, and so you have to work it out, and it's really interesting. Yeah. It probably is the same as the magic roundabout in Swindon.
Let me see here. And again, I think people, when I ask people about this, they say it's terrifying and they're saying it's kind of scary, and they definitely remember it or remember kind of the first time having to navigate it. And the same thing when we apply to autonomy and the ideas we're going to talk about today is I want to kind of also recognize the fact that this isn't something that everyone can just kind of immediately navigate with confidence. Giving people autonomy, kind of dialing that up a little bit as a leader, as a manager, as a colleague, or being given that extra autonomy can feel a bit awkward. It can feel different. It can feel a bit clumsy. You don't know quite what the outcome is going to be. It can be a bit scary because you're being told, being trusted, maybe if you've got autonomy, to kind of make your own decisions. And if you haven't been doing that, you might think, well, what's the consequence of this if it doesn't quite go right? So it's this. I want you to kind of people to think about when we're talking about autonomy, about the same idea when it in terms of this idea of clumsiness. A message, it's a skill. It's a confidence that we need to build up. It's not something we go from 0 to 100.
Absolutely.
Straight away.
It reminds me of Spider-Man. With power comes great responsibility.
Yeah, well, exactly. I think that's it. And I think sometimes we forget about that with autonomy. We kind of we think it's the easy takeaway from this is autonomy good, lack of autonomy is bad. And of course, as we know in psychology, everything's grey and everything's in context and nuanced within those circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, you can understand why both individuals struggle with it a little bit as well. I mean, we want it, but it can be difficult to accept sometimes. But also, you think about organizations over the last 3-4 decades and more. The search has ultimately been for efficiency, hasn't it? And that's about doing things in a specific way over and over and over again. Yeah. And the dominance of paradigm has been the hierarchy. Yeah. So, one imagines that that's not great for autonomy.
No, I think say no. I think you get more autonomy at the top. So if you're at the top of a leadership position, you tend to get more discretion on something. It feels that might feel good. But I think those traditional hierarchies that you've discussed, which are very top down in terms of flows of information and flows of decision, with the focus on efficiency rather than effectiveness, I'd say efficiency in terms of clarity, in terms of making decisions, then certainly that tends to impede in terms of autonomy. And again, we'll talk about some research, get into some kind of harder research in a little bit maybe, but the research shows that when those kind of traditional command and controls people feel that they're kind of they a bit stifled in terms of their ability to kind of flex in their role. They don't feel fully engaged as a consequence of that, because they're basically enacting they've been told to do rather than necessarily having the space and freedom to do so. And I think one of the challenges that a lot of organizations are facing, that are trying to bring more autonomy in, is that we're fighting against kind of literally hundreds of years of management practice and kind of behavior of saying this is how you set up an organization, or this is how you get people to do their roles, and it works. You can't. Yeah. It's been working for years, but it's not. What we do know is that it leaves we know from the research perspective, suggests that people aren't fully energized and engaged as they could be, and you'll see this from your work that you do with your clients. And part of the reason I think some of that's left on the table, that people don't bring it to work, is this lack of kind of autonomy.
Yeah. So tell me a bit more about the research and what it.
So I think the one in terms of the research, there's two ways of looking at this. So one is I think it's important in terms of we're looking at kind of from a psychological human perspective in terms of what are kind of our basic human needs, and this is kind of building on work by Deci and Ryan, and something called self-determination theory, which a number of people may be familiar with here. And these are kind of the core pillars, I suppose, of motivation and energy and engagement. And fundamentally, these researchers have suggested that there's three things that as humans we look for in the well, effectively, when we're doing anything in terms of engagement. So one is around autonomy, which is a central kind of pillar that we've been talking about already. The second is around competence, the ability to show that we're showing up well. And the third is in terms of relatedness. Now, if you were to do a Google search for self-determination theory, or SDT, there's an avalanche of kind of high quality kind of papers that are showing that kind of time and again these come back. So that's one in terms of from a research, and we won't go into that in kind of significant detail today maybe, but just to say that that's there that people can look at. And it's
and I just wanted to interject. I mean, it is very much, as psychological theory goes, it's pretty much the gold standard, isn't it? The really self-determination theory. But people might also recognize Dan Pink's drive, which is a slight repackaging, shall we say, of the theory, but the core elements are pretty similar.
Yeah, Dan, I mean, as in his book, Drive's brilliant book, very accessible, and he's, again, there's TED Talks of him speaking, which is talks about these, and he did interview Desiree, right? I think, well, at least one of them for the research, who acknowledges it, but he's repackaged it slightly, and I think so. From my perspective, what I'm interested in from a research is around how we bring those kind of different elements, and say autonomy is part of that, to life within organizations, and you can do that top down, and you can do that kind of bottom up. And if we look at the research from a top down perspective, maybe, and I'll just again share a slide, and I can add a note in here. There's a really good piece of research by Dr. Gavin Slent in the University of Melbourne, and I've put in the chat, and people can share afterwards the link to this paper that he's written. This is a summary paper that I'll send you the link to and the paper itself is really good. And he was looking at what were he looked at a meta study of engagement and the leadership kind of relationships to that. So he surveyed over, just looking at my notes, I think it was 18,000 employees across the globe. So in terms of these studies looked at, and they kind of fundamentally identified that the leaders who showed a autonomous supportive style, so they refer to as autonomy supportive, which isn't necessarily the sexiest kind of title of leadership, but what it was referring to, leadership where you give people discretion, you give people autonomy, and you support them. So you don't give them autonomy and just say, go and do it, and I'm going to punish you if you don't get this right. It's doing it in a way of saying, I'm giving you freedom and we'll work this out together, but I want you to input in terms of these tasks. They found that there was a significant link from a research in terms of lots of positive outcomes that most people on this call will be kind of looking for within their organization, such as intrinsic motivation, workplace well-being, job satisfaction, commitment, loyalty, and high levels of engagement. I mean, who wouldn't want that? And it was saying that leaders who acted in this style, so this would be kind of maybe providing opportunity to make choices in your own decisions. It could be around showing an interest in employees and demonstrating empathy and checking in with people, and encouraging ownership over goals and goal setting, and asking people to kind of work within boundaries. So it's not around letting people just kind of go off and do their own thing, but giving people boundaries and operating within that, and avoiding the kind of researchers noted as well that the leaders who tended to act in this style, so this autonomous supportive style, tended to, where possible, minimize where they were micromanaging, or if they did micromanage, they did it in a way that they was kind of very specific, and they explain why. So they might say, Rob, I need you to do this task in this certain way because of the following reason. So it was kind of very much, you have to do it this way, there's no autonomy here, but they tended to kind of call it out, and they tended to use it and as an exception rather than the default.
I mean, as you alluded to, at the top of the hierarchy, it's quite easy to give autonomy, isn't it? And sometimes, particularly in professional roles and senior roles, it can come with quite a bit of ambiguity, and you kind of have to work it out for yourself a little bit. Yeah. But it's really important that there's a couple of things I really wanted to highlight. One is that this, what you're saying is it's not a sink or swim environment. It's the support is a really important part of that.
Yes.
But I also kind of wanted to explore a little bit more about, not everybody is. It's kind of easy to visualize in a white collar environment, if you like, what autonomy can look like. But let's say lots of our clients are in environments like retail or manufacturing lines or logistics, where things have to be a certain way, and you can't just come or go as you please, all that sort of stuff. What does it look like in different kinds of environments?
Yeah. So this will kind of lead on to a little bit. We'll talk about jobs. So this is, I think we're talking about from a leadership perspective, management perspective, a top down, I suppose, perspective. Yeah. I think it'd be nice to talk about job crafting a little bit, which is around top bottom up. So I won't talk about that now in terms of this question. Okay. But I think, so way I've seen that when I've had discussions with organizations wrestling with this it's around saying this is the outcome that we need to achieve almost. So if there is, as you're saying, there is no black or white in terms of, you know, when you clock in and clock off in terms of your work, or how you kind of I don't know, clean a room, I'm thinking that, or how you greet a customer or something like that. If there are certain ground rules, you basically have to say that's the end point. But what you can try and do is saying within that, what's the best way of you getting to that end point? So in terms of actually, is there any discretion or autonomy in terms of how you do that? So often there's an example that we've kind of seen within, I've done this within the contact center, say, where we've got very clear expectations in terms of timescales they need to kind of meet with a particular client. What we found when we've said, look, we're really interested in you bringing some autonomy to kind of freedoms and flexibility into how you do this, what could you do? They find really small and innovative ways of doing this. So it's around, in terms of a leader, it's around creating a space and being curious about saying, look, we've decided for whatever reason, this is what we need, and then create the space and the opportunity for colleagues to say, what could you do within the edges of this? So someone often refers, like, you've got 99% of your box can maybe fill up, but there might be 1% around the edges, and it's actually recognizing that 1% and doing something with it. I mean, ideally, if people are acting in a more organizations that are maybe more kind of autonomy focused, what you'll be doing when you come to those decisions, when you're putting those kind of guidelines and saying you need to clock in on these hours or you need to act in this way, you will have made those decisions with input, with the contribution of colleagues. They feel they would have had some autonomy in terms of contributing to that. Now, that's not, again, realistically, that's not something that everyone will do or everyone will explain, but it's around finding those opportunities from being curious about it, asking people, what do you think? It's not difficult, but often people are scared to do it because they're scared of the answers. But they have people are thinking about this anyway. The colleagues are thinking on the shop floor, well, we could do this in a better way, or we could, the hours that don't work. But if they're not saying it, they're still thinking it, then you'd be much better to hear what they're saying. And even if you don't do anything on it, it's better to show that you're listening and you've heard what they're saying.
Well, one of the things that we see is, you know, because autonomy is a really important part of our framework, is that in every environment, it's clear that when we ask a question, we say something like, you know, I have an appropriate level of autonomy in my role. People are quick to answer that. You know, people that work in very different environments are able to say, yes, I agree, I have an appropriate level of autonomy for my role, and we tend to see pretty good, you know, scores overall for that. So it suggests that people kind of understand. So if I work in a, you know, in an assembly plant, I understand that there's only a certain amount of autonomy that will be appropriate in my role. But we see it slightly differently when it comes to things like the more deliberate stuff, like you know, being involved in decisions that affect them and things. We tend to see that being often a little bit lower in the data that we see. But it's interesting the point that in different environments, people perceiving themselves to having what, you know, we're just using a word like appropriate, you know.
Appropriate autonomy. I think it's a really interesting question about appropriate. The other way that I often do this with groups or individual, get people in coaching in terms of environments as well, saying, you know, get a line between 0 and 10, and you have more sophisticated ways of doing it for the work that you do. And like on that line, Mark, how much autonomy do you think you currently have? How much freedom and flexibility do you have? And how much do you want? And I think that's really interesting in terms of that gap. And I think there's an assumption that everyone necessarily wants more autonomy, and that's not always the case. So particularly maybe if you're early in your career or starting a new job and you're not quite clear in terms of direction, or you don't feel particularly safe in terms of that environment, you might see autonomy as a threat. And so I think it's important that we don't kind of default to kind of the idea of saying autonomy good, lack of autonomy bad. But I think being curious about autonomy is the most important thing to do. And are you getting at the appropriate, to use your language, the appropriate level? That's the golden question, I suppose, in understanding that.
It is also paradoxical, isn't it? Because you may want that freedom, and that's important. But we also, you know, I may want freedom, and I may also want, you know, clarity and structure and other things that will actually help me. And that might feed into one of the other needs a little bit more around, you know, in self-determination theory and competence, you know. But if I lack the structure that I need to feel competent, I will perhaps want less autonomy.
Yeah, you see it as a threat to that, and kind of knocks down that pillar, it kind of crumbles. And I think, that's why I think they come in the triad in terms of those three different elements. And I'll just, can I do my gratuitous shot of my daughters? This is what I was talking to you about self, and then let's talk about job crafting, maybe, Rob, in terms of the kind of another approach to the bottom up to figure
definitely.
if you're up for that. So this is just one thing in terms of, I was reflecting on this conversation before I had with Rob about kind of whether self-determination theory was a human need or not. And I've got a 3-year-old with my wife, so Evie, and one of the things that I found when I was really recently was mapping self-determination theory, particularly and autonomy, amongst her behaviors. So very much I kind of see her kind of saying in the mornings, it's a constant wrestling frustration at the moment of trying to put on her jacket at the moment, because she wants to do it herself, to zip up herself. So this is the idea of, I can do it. So this is the autonomy kind of coming through that we can see, and we haven't taught her this. This is something just comes from her motivation. It's around to kind of this idea of also, when she's doing kind of tasks and activities at the moment, she's often saying, look at me, look at this picture, look at kind of do this. And that's around this competence, as you're saying, Rob. And then the kind of the last bit, the why question, relates to kind of purpose or relatedness, which is kind of links to the self-determination theory that they are, which is around a connection to something bigger or something different. And I think we see it in young people, and it doesn't get knocked out of us, it's there. But I think when we get to organizations where, again, we go back to Mr. Perfect, thinking we don't need this anymore, rather than recognizing as messy human beings, this is something that we all need.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's so that's great. So just to sum up, it's important to be able to build that environment where people feel a sense of autonomy, and that requires support as well, and a fair amount of skill on the part of the leader. That can be quite a challenge too. But so tell us about the other approach, the bottom-up approach.
Yeah, so if we talked about semi-autonomous leaders as kind of how you can infuse it from bottom up, so leaders to do it. So one of the areas that I'm really interested in terms of, and from a research perspective and practice perspective, is around kind of encouraging this from a bottom-up perspective. So actually encouraging individuals themselves to shape their roles, to give them autonomy, and saying, but do something proactively with it. And there's a concept called job crafting, which is where I spend a lot of time focusing my attention and working with organizations. And job crafting is effectively saying you're encouraging individuals to shape and positively kind of improve their jobs in a way that could reflect their behaviors, their strengths, their interests. So it's around making your job a better fit for you as an individual. So if you think about your job a bit like a jacket or a suit or something, what you're doing, some of us will kind of feel a bit tight, some of us will be suffocating, maybe some of it will be a bit loose and baggy and not enough, not sharp enough. And what you're doing with job crafting is you're saying you're taking the job and trying to make it just a better fit for you. So you're not fundamentally redesigning your job, you're not fundamentally kind of ripping out your job descriptions, but you are finding small and subtle and positive ways to improve the existing job that you have. And so this links very much in terms of autonomy. So what you're doing is you're creating the space and the freedom and the encouragement to saying to people, how can you make your job better? And it's still working within the confines of your role, of those kind of guiding principles. You're not kind of going outside of that, but saying, how can you make your job better? And we found from the work that we've done, but also from a research perspective, that people can do this at kind of all levels of an organization. So the retail space, from contact centers, cleaners, and the first ever paper written about job crafting in 2001 by Amy Wisniewski and Jane Dutton was about hospital cleaners. So it's really fascinating to me that this wasn't like a white collar knowledge worker kind of thing that they've tried to kind of fit into a kind of a less traditional autonomous kind of role. Actually, they found the first time they spotted this was within cleaners, and in part that's because I think when people don't have autonomy in their role, they're screaming out to find it. This idea of oxygen again, like people are desperate to find ways to kind of make their jobs meaningful and better connecting to fit for them as individuals. And you see it at all levels.
So what kind of, you've got some examples of what you've seen at those different levels that what people have done?
Yeah, sure. So let's talk about kind of some different examples, and I've collected literally thousands of these, so we could go through this. And if anyone's got, and maybe on the chat as well, if anyone wants any job crafting examples from a specific sector or context, put them in the chat, and I'll try and remember them. But let's start with I'll talk about the first ever one, kind of when I did my first ever job crafting workshop. So I discovered job crafting when I was studying for my master's in positive psychology, and it was at the time there'd been no intervention studies to look at. So there's been lots of studies showing the positive attributes to it, but none actually encouraging it to work. Yeah. So I designed a workshop to do this and tested out of College University of Melbourne. And one of the first people who came to the session was an IT worker who sat on a contact center. They call the person you called when your computer wasn't working, the person who told you to turn your computer off and turn it back on again. That was him. His strength, well, one of the things when you're looking at job crafting, when I encourage people to do it, is saying, what are the things that matter to you? What would you like to do more of in terms of your job? What could you dial up? And he was saying one of the things that he had is analytical skills, so in problem solving. And he also kind of mentioned his frustration, the fact that he was spotting patterns and issues with the calls that he was getting to do with certain software applications or certain kind of buildings maybe that weren't getting kind of fixed. So they were logging the reports and they were getting sent to senior management, but nothing was happening to them. And he based on the workshop kind of said, well, I'm going to go and chat to my manager about doing something different or discussing this issue more. And we're saying, can I produce the information to the management group in a different way, so maybe to present the themes or something that I'm spotting or colleagues are spotting on the floor. So something that wouldn't take him very long to do, like an hour or something to time to sit down and to present this. And his manager could have said, yeah, do that. But then having seen the report, he said, well, why don't you kind of come and present this to the leadership team? So it's like, we used to present the paper. It was always appended to the meeting of the IT team, of the call logs or the fault logs, but no one ever really scrutinized it. It was just appended. So instead, they had a 5-minute from the ground kind of highlight kind of section at the start of the meeting, where they said, this is what it's like on the ground floor at the moment with our service users. And Paul talked about the kind of key themes that came out. Mm-hmm. And who knew, but actually people started to do something about the problems. They started, oh, we need to fix that, and we need to iterate on it. And that wasn't the kind of the end result wasn't driven by him in terms of the job crafting. All he wanted to do at the starting point was saying, I want to dial up my analytical abilities more, mm-hmm. and actually do problem solve to spot some of these problems. And that's what he wanted to do. But, and this often happens with job crafting, is that kind of it leads to kind of unexpected outcomes or benefits. So once his manager saw this, he was saying, actually, no, this would be more powerful if you presented this. He saw this as an opportunity, which wouldn't have been created if that person hadn't done it in the first instance. So that's kind of one example. I'm just seeing if we've got any other things, sectors coming in the chat. So not specifically about you, Rob. Have you got anything that you think your users would be?
I'd love, it'd be great to hear about, something where, we traditionally think of the job as being quite sort of nailed down, really, and I suppose to a certain extent IT support is a little bit like that, but there is perhaps that problem solving element embedded in it, but in sort of some more sort of traditional, if you like, blue collar environments.
Sure. So let me give you two different examples then. So one was around cleaners, and I've done this work with kind of cleaning crews, and so often when I work with organizations, I kind of said, before we go big bang and say job crafting is for everyone, in the same way you're saying autonomy is for everyone, actually let's be critical about this, let's collect some evidence. Mm-hmm. So I often say, let's find a group of skeptical people, who often tend to be IT teams or legal teams, funny enough, and people who are going to be supporters, which are going to be HR, and people maybe you don't know it's going to work. So it's going to be, we know we're curious about whether they could do this. So one organization I went and did some work with the cleaning crew, and this was we don't know what they're going to make of this kind of group. And what we discussed the concept with them, we discussed the ideas and saying, what could you do differently about your job to make it better? What experiments could you do? Because often I try and encourage people to think about this as an experimental kind of way forward. And one of the ideas that kind of stuck in my mind was one of the cleaning crew was saying, some of the buildings that I clean, there's more difficult spaces and easier spaces, or places I find more fun to clean than others. And again, I haven't got a sense of what that would look like in terms of those things that some were easier than other spaces. And what that person did, they realized, is that they always just cleaned in the same way in every room 1, room 2, and it was because that's how they've been shown to do it, and that's so they always did that. So instead, what they realized is saying, well, actually, I can break that pattern if I want to. I can clean rooms in different ways or in different times. So what they would do is they'd ask themselves at the start of the day is like, what do I want to do today? Do I want to do the hardest thing first? Do I want to do the easiest thing first? Do I want to do the normal pattern? Just depending on how they're feeling that day. And it was like, it gave them permission to just do something a bit different in terms of suiting their mood. And they'd got into that pattern of behavior. And I think we all do that, where we sleepwalk through work without thinking about how we can improve it and do things differently. And they would just, that's a really simple example of how they connected to their kind of mood on the day and change things up a little bit. Another one of the cleaning crew said they liked connecting with colleagues. So that was something that was important to them. And so they would come along, and before the cleaning started, they would get there like half an hour earlier, I think there was, and have a cup of coffee and sit down, and they'll read the paper, or they'd say, or if colleagues were there, they would then have a chat. But it was like, I'm going to turn up for work half an hour earlier, but that was their discretion. They wanted to do this and let others know that, so we can just have that opportunity for chit chat before we started our shift. And that was because it mattered to them that they had that opportunity to connect with colleagues, and they weren't rushing from one thing to the next. Now, that wouldn't work for everyone, but it did work for that particular individual.
I think it's a really interesting one, just about the order the cleaning staff did the rooms in, because it's, how many times would anyone have actually questioned whether you do it room 1, 2, 3, 4 or not? But it's immaterial, isn't it? Those crews know that they need to get them all done by a certain point in the day and to a certain standard. But just that it's a small thing, and that's what I mean by that kind of appropriateness. It's about people just having some degree of influence over their work.
But it would absolutely that. But it would be very different from the manager saying, go and do this room, depending if you're feeling good on day one, do this room, this space, or you do this one. It came from the power of job crafting, the power of the autonomy was that it came from that individual to do it. So you could instruct someone to do that, but you'd take out that all the kind of
two levels, isn't it?
Of it. So you get back to that traffic light scenario again, rather than that roundabout scenario.
There's 2 levels of autonomy there, isn't there? There's the autonomy to make the suggestion in the first place, as well as the autonomy around making the choice.
Yes.
And I can give you permission to choose the order.
Yes.
But you having actually come up with that idea.
Is but not and doing that in the way that I often do with job, it's a playful way. So it's low stakes. It's not a threat position, because again, particularly if you're not used to having any autonomy in your roles. And you talked about blue collar, that is traditionally with blue, not every blue collar, but that's kind of the tradition of the kind of thing. It can be seen as a source of threat, because if I get this wrong, I'm going to get punished or fired or whatever. So you need to kind of be careful about how you introduce it in that kind of.
I use the terms blue collar and white collar, but it's not really. You have sort of what traditionally blue collar roles, which are very craft driven and very. With quite a lot of autonomy, and you've got white collar roles which are very process driven and don't allow much. So there's not that it's a sort of a false distinction that I introduced a little bit, but there's a heavily processed roles, and
I think that makes sense in terms of they're very clear maybe the boundaries of their roles in terms of what's expected of them are very more defined. Should I go the opposite way and just give you one about senior leader?
I'd love to.
Sometimes, again, this is counterintuitive. Well, it was for me, at least, the first time I kind of worked with this, is that sometimes people can have too much autonomy. So it's like, I've got massive of it. I don't know where to go. I need some clarity. And that's why a lot of people find coaching so powerful and useful, because at more senior roles, because it actually gives them an opportunity to kind of actually create their own pathways and that space to think about how to use their autonomy. And I think often that's what coaching does. It kind of fills that gap in terms of how can I use my autonomy well, if that makes sense. And so when, in a similar way for job crafting, when we're trying to give people some frameworks, they can be just as useful when you've got lots of it, because you don't know what to do or where to use your attention. And there was a couple of things that would kind of spring to mind. So these relate to Virgin Money. I did work with the bank there, financial services. So one was someone who worked within marketing, and she was a senior leader and a manager, and she spent a lot of time with colleagues, but what she realized is that she didn't spend any time connecting to her colleagues. So she was literally run from meeting to meeting to meeting, and this has been accelerated, a lot of us, for working remotely as well, where we kind of just very jump from a meeting, and she didn't connect with her colleagues, and yet a sense of connection was something that was really important to her. So again, when it comes to autonomy, it's saying, how do you want to use your autonomy? What's the things that matter to you? And understanding that, because people's autonomy looks different from one person to the next. And what she wanted to do was create a sense of connection with her colleagues. So once a day, and this was back in, this is pre-pandemic, just this example kind of jumped to mind, she would deliberately spend an extra 5 minutes either going around someone's desk and chatting to them, where they would have previously emailed them, or staying on a phone call later or a video call, just to connect and have that kind of conversation, which sounds really simple, but it was a big difference from her, because she wasn't doing it deliberately. She was just running otherwise from meeting to meeting.
Yeah.
And she found that doing that, every time she did it, she just felt better about herself, because she was connecting with a colleague. And it was, again, selfishly, it was about her wanting to connect with her colleagues. But the unexpected outcome of this was that she, about a month later, one of her colleagues kind of pulled her aside or mentioned her, so it was like, we've been seeing you more walking the corridor. Is this something, your new management technique of walking the corridors or something, because we're seeing you about? And of course that wasn't, but they had, colleagues have picked up on this additional just little bit of time connecting with them, and they'd really positively valued that and connected with it. And it was just a very deliberate kind of experiment, again, of saying, can I just spend an extra 5 minutes to connect with my colleagues? It matters to me, and it made a difference to them. So that's one example, and I'll give you one more if that's okay, and then we can go off topic. So the other worked in some project management, and this was connecting connecting to the purpose of their role. So these were working in IT. Again, this is within Virgin Money, but within the IT teams, and so they dealt with a lot of kind of complex kind of project management change and infrastructure, and they would run the project, execute, have a quick kind of review period of that, and then move on to the next project. So that's kind of what they would do. But they were saying sometimes they didn't actually get to see the benefit of the purpose or the meaning of the impact of the work that they were doing, because they were just, the impact was kind of almost fulfilling the project brief, if that makes sense, not seeing the benefit of the intervention, or maybe learning if it didn't work. And what they decided to do was set up coffee conversations with project leads or people within a project from 6 months to a year ago, like in the past, so they could go and have a conversation with them saying, we did that project finished, how are things now 6 months, a year on from that project? And what they found is that they could have a much more open conversation, because when you do a retrospective, everyone wants to kind of just say, yeah, that's great. No one wants to dig into details. Everyone wants to just kind of get on with it. Like, they don't have that's the space, and so it's quite raw still. Whereas this kind of 6 months and they could be more genuinely open, because there was lower stakes in terms of saying, well, actually, this worked well, this didn't work well. These are things I remember about that project that kind of worked well. And that manager was saying, he learned, again, the unexpected outcome was that not only did he see that some of the things that kind of worked well in ways that he wasn't expecting in terms of the project, some things that didn't land, that seemed to be working, that didn't ultimately land well, but the feedback that he got from colleagues about the things that they remembered, the things they valued in terms of how the project shaped how he and his project team did their work going forward. And it was just because they created that space and that time to have those anecdotal conversations, because he wanted to connect to his purpose, but it ultimately shaped how he saw his existing job and role. So that's another example, again, of a small example of how someone connected. And that example was purpose crafting, so connecting to the purpose of their role. So
you've a couple of times now you've mentioned, kind of in different words, keeping the stakes low, being playful about it, small steps, if you like. So how would you recommend people get started with this?
So with job crafting, I think with both elements, actually, I'd say, in terms of what's the easiest, if you're thinking about as a manager on this call, thinking about how I can dial this up with my teams, or if you're saying, how can I encourage job crafting, or how can I job craft myself, if you want to kind of do it for yourself. I kind of encourage people to think about what's the smallest, most positive thing you can do that you're interested in doing, but you can do it in a small and ideally measurable way, so you can actually collect some kind of data, whatever that looks like for you, in terms of the outcome of that. So when it comes to job crafting, one of the questions I often give people is, imagine that you've got a budget of 10 to 15 minutes a day or an hour a week, and that encourages people to think playfully and creatively. What's something that you could do differently about your job? And that's the kind of the budget that I gave the people in kind of Virgin Money.
Yeah.
And that's also the budget I gave the cleaners. So saying again, you know, what could you do with that budget to do something different, you know, to do differently? If you had that hour, how could you invest it? And when you look at it in that way, you're not changing the footprint of the job fundamentally, but you're working within the edges and around them. But the more you do it, the more you subtly change your job. And if you continually do this, you're continually shaping and evolving your work. And again, if we're coming back to autonomy, that's what everyone wants. Everyone wants to be kind of feeling that we're constantly changing, constantly evolving, and allowing your work to do that as well.
So it becomes an iterative process.
Yeah, well, that's a perfect way. You should have summed that up.
Yeah.
Then move on. Yeah.
So I understand. So it would be great to open the floor to questions.
Yeah.
I know we've had some issues with LinkedIn, so I'm not sure how many we'll get from there. But any questions that people got, and I also understand that you've got a resource that you could share with people.
Yeah, so that's true. So we've got some resources, and we can kind of put those into the links in terms of job crafting guides or some other links to the to Taylor Thinking resources. And there is the book. So the book that I've written, if you want to deep dive into job crafting specifically, but within the book Personalization at Work, we do also look at autonomy more broadly as organizationally and the importance of it. So if you're interested in autonomy and wanting a deeper dive, there's lots of other kind of great books out there, but mine's kind of one option that you could.
Yours is the best. Yeah.
Oh, mine's the best. Mine's the best. Yes.
So well, while you share that, any questions? Anyone? Or comments? Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, great. Some feedback. Thanks, Kate. Really interesting session. Well, I hope so. And we aim to please. Okay, so if there are no questions, then what we'll do, nothing else to do but to thank you, Rob, for sharing your time with us, and to thank everybody who has given us the time to be with us, and hopefully those people that were on LinkedIn are still with us too.
Yeah, I hope so. Well, thanks so much for the opportunity.
We will also be sharing the recording of this, so we'll be able to get it to those people that registered. Oh, great. Well,
thank you. I really enjoyed that. It was fun. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Hey, thanks everybody, and goodbye.